Imagine for a moment a man so powerful he owned fleets of commercial airliners, not for carrying passengers, but for transporting mountains of cocaine. A man so audacious, he turned the sky itself into his personal highway, bending international aviation to his will. A man so elusive that when the world's most powerful governments finally closed in, he chose to vanish not into the shadows, but to literally have his face erased, becoming a ghost in his own life. This is not a work of fiction. This is the story of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the man they called LC, or de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. But before we descend into his labyrinth of power, crime, and ultimate mystery, a crucial disclaimer. The tale you are about to hear is a synthesis of historical accounts, declassified documents, journalistic investigations, and law enforcement testimonies. The full, unvarnished truth, known only to a few, is lost to the violent annals of the drug war. Our purpose here is not to glorify, but to present a meticulously researched narrative to understand the mechanisms of power and the inevitable price of such a life. So, if you are ready to unravel one of the most shocking chapters in criminal history, settle in. This is the story of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. In his own words you will never hear. Our story begins not in a palace, but in the humble, rugged terrain of Sinaloa, Mexico, in a town called Guamuchilito, part of the municipality of Navaleto. It was here on December 17, 1956, that Amado Carrillo Fuentes was born into a family with deep, albeit modest, roots in the region's primary illicit economy, the cultivation of opium poppies and marijuana. Sinaloa has long been known as the cradle of Mexican drug trafficking, a place where the line between legitimate agriculture and forbidden harvest was often blurred by economic necessity and a culture of defiance towards central authority. The young Amado did not grow up in profound poverty, but his environment was steeped in the logistics of the trade. He saw from his earliest days how plants were transformed into commodities, and how those commodities moved along hidden routes, evading the eyes of the law. His uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, better known as Don Nito, was already a significant figure in the Guadalajara cartel, one of the pioneering organizations that would lay the groundwork for the colossal empires to come. This familial connection was not just a footnote. It was the gateway, the university of crime that would shape Amado's destiny. He was not a brash, loud-mouthed aspirant. Even in his youth, those who knew him described a quiet, observant, and intensely calculating boy. One who absorbed lessons in silence, learning the value of discretion and the immense power of saying very little. He watched the flamboyant traffickers with their gold chains and loud cars, and he learned what not to do. He understood that attention was a currency more dangerous than pesos or dollars, and that to spend it frivolously was to invite ruin. This inherent understanding of operational security, of the paramount importance of staying in the shadows, would become the cornerstone of his entire empire. While other boys his age dreamed of being soldiers or footballers, Amado's education was in supply chains, in corruption networks, in the subtle art of persuasion through bribery or intimidation. He learned that every official had a price, and that every route could be secured, not just with weapons, but with the quieter, more durable weapon of financial incentive. He started small, as most do, running errands, acting as a lookout, moving small packages from one village to another. It was a slow, meticulous apprenticeship in the family business, but the business itself was on the verge of a seismic shift that would catapult the quiet boy from Sinaloa into a stratosphere of criminality previously unimaginable. The catalyst for this shift was not happening in the Mexican mountains, however, but in the coastal cities of Colombia, where a new, more potent, and infinitely more lucrative product was beginning to flood the international market, cocaine. And it was this white powder, this catalyst for a new kind of gold rush, that would provide Amado Carrillo Fuentes with the opportunity to apply his quiet, logistical genius on a scale that would redefine the very meaning of organized crime. The seismic shift from traditional plant-based narcotics to the sleek, high-profit world of cocaine did not just present an opportunity, it demanded a new kind of criminal architect. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, now in his late 20s, was perfectly positioned to become that architect. He had graduated from his small time errands and was working closely with his uncle, Don Nito, and the burgeoning Guadalajara cartel, then under the formidable leadership of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Felix Gallardo, often called the Godfather, had a visionary plan to consolidate the various Mexican trafficking factions into a single, powerful syndicate, a federation that would control all drug movement through Mexico. In this new structure, Amado began not as a king, but as a key lieutenant, a jefe de plaza in the vital border city of Ojinaga, across from Presidio, Texas. This was his first real test of independent command, and it was here that he honed the skills that would define his reign. Ojinaga was a brutal, dusty crucible, a perpetual battleground for control of the smuggling routes into the United States. It was a place where authority was asserted not with memos and meetings, but with Kalashnikovs and carnage. Amado, however, displayed a unique blend of ruthlessness and strategic cunning. He understood that to control a plaza was not merely to win firefights. It was to control the entire ecosystem around it. He systematically corrupted the local, state, and federal police, the Mexican military units stationed in the area, and the political apparatus. He installed his own men in key positions, creating a parallel government where his word was the ultimate law. Those who opposed him were eliminated with terrifying efficiency, their bodies often displayed as grim warnings. But for those who collaborated, the rewards were immense. He became a shadow employer, pumping money into the local economy and building a base of loyalty, or at least complicit silence, that was as strong as any fortress. It was during this period that he earned another, darker nickname, ELC or de la Muerte, the Lord of Death. Yet, even as his reputation for violence grew, he remained an enigma, rarely seen in public, never giving interviews. A phantom whose power was felt everywhere, but whose face was known to few. This low profile became his greatest asset, especially when the Guadalajara cartel began to implode under the weight of its own notoriety. The catalyst for its downfall was the brutal murder of U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985. The international outrage and unprecedented cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities that followed shattered F.A. Lix Gallardo's federation. Don Nito was captured. Other key players were killed or arrested. F.A. Lix Gallardo himself was finally apprehended in 1989, the Godfather, from his prison cell, attempted to manage the fallout by dividing his vast empire among his most trusted lieutenants, the so-called Arellano F.A. Lix brothers taking Tijuana, the Carrillo Fuentes family taking Ciudad Juárez, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman taking the Pacific coast. This division was not a peaceful succession. It was a fracture line that would ignite decades of war. And into this power vacuum, from his bloody apprenticeship in Ojinaga, stepped Amado Carrillo Fuentes. He did not just inherit the Juárez Plaza, he saw it for what it was, the ultimate logistical hub. Ciudad Juárez, facing El Paso, Texas, was one of the busiest border crossings in the world. It was a smuggler's dream, a place where the sheer volume of legal trade provided perfect cover for the illegal. But Amado's vision extended far beyond running someone else's product through a single border town. He watched the Colombian cartels, particularly the Cali and Medellin cartels, who were then the undisputed kings of cocaine. They produced the drug in unimaginable quantities, but they faced a monumental logistical problem getting it to the insatiable U.S. market. Their preferred method, using small, fast planes and boats to the Caribbean and Florida, was under relentless assault by American authorities. Amado approached them not as a subordinate border smuggler, but as a strategic partner with a superior solution. He proposed a simple, yet revolutionary, business model. He would take full responsibility for the cocaine the moment it left Colombia. He would handle all transportation through Mexico, all storage, all security, all bribery of Mexican officials, and all delivery across the U.S. border. In return, he would charge a fee, not for the risk per kilo, but for his service. This was the birth of the transportation model that would come to define Mexican cartels. The Colombians, impressed by his control over the Juárez corridor and his reputation for ruthless efficiency, agreed. This partnership was the catalyst that transformed Amado from a regional boss into a global narcotics powerhouse. He was no longer just a trafficker. He was a logistics magnate, the head of the world's most sophisticated and deadly shipping company. With the Colombian cartels now as his clients, Amado Carrillo Fuentes embarked on an operational expansion so audacious it would cement his legend and earn him his most famous title. The existing methods of smuggling, small planes on moonless nights, hidden compartments in trucks, tunnels under the border, were effective but limited in scale. They were like using a garden hose to fill an Olympic swimming pool. They worked, but they could not meet the colossal demand he was now tasked with supplying. Amado's genius was to think bigger, to think in terms of industrial, scale logistics. He looked to the skies, not at the small Cessnas and Pipers used by his rivals, but at the very symbol of legitimate global commerce, the commercial jet airliner. His plan was breathtakingly simple and utterly revolutionary. He would acquire a fleet of large passenger and cargo planes, primarily Boeing 727s, and use them to fly directly from Colombia or from remote airstrips in other parts of South America into the vast, unmonitored expanses of northern Mexico. The Boeing 727 was the perfect vessel for his enterprise. It was a workhorse of the aviation industry, reliable, capable of landing on relatively short, unpaved runways, and its rear-mounted engines made it quieter on approach, a small but crucial detail for clandestine night landings. He did not acquire one or two of these aircraft. He built an entire shadow airline. Some planes were purchased outright through a labyrinth of shell companies based in Panama, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, while others were leased from legitimate but complicit or duped aviation firms. He recruited a small army of pilots, navigators, ground crew, and mechanics, paying them salaries that dwarfed anything they could earn in the legitimate aviation sector, which was itself in a state of turmoil. These were not just greedy opportunists. Many were highly skilled professionals, seduced by the technical challenge and the immense financial reward, becoming willing participants in the world's most ambitious smuggling operation. The flights themselves were feats of precision and daring, laden with 5, 6, even up to 10 tons of pure cocaine per flight. These giant metal birds would take off from hidden jungle airstrips, flying low to avoid radar detection on their journey north. They would cross into Mexican airspace, where Amado's corruption of the military and air traffic control ensured they were virtually invisible to officialdom. Their destinations were not major airports, but long, deserted runways in the Sonoran Desert, or specially widened and paved sections of remote highways in states like Chihuahua and Sinaloa. Upon landing, fleets of trucks and armed convoys would be waiting. The cargo would be offloaded with military efficiency, and the plane would often be abandoned, set ablaze to destroy forensic evidence, or sometimes even dismantled and buried in massive desert graves. The sheer volume of cocaine he moved was staggering, dwarfing the combined efforts of all his rivals. It was this fleet, this aerial armada, that operated with the regularity and precision of a major airline, that earned him the name that would echo through the annals of crime, El C, or de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. His wealth exploded exponentially. While precise figures are impossible to verify, the U.S. government and other analysts estimated that at the absolute peak of his power in the mid-1990s, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was generating revenues of over $200 million per week. His personal net worth was estimated to be in the tens of billions of dollars, making him arguably one of the wealthiest criminals in human history. This unimaginable river of cash did not just sit in bank accounts. It became the primary tool of his empire's expansion and defense. He built a financial apparatus so sophisticated it rivaled that of a small nation, employing accountants, lawyers, and bankers to launder his profits through a global maze of investments, real estate in Mexico City, Acapulco, and the United States, vast ranches and agricultural businesses, front companies in every sector imaginable, and complex currency exchange schemes that moved millions through casinos and financial institutions. He did not just bribe officials, he purchased entire institutions. It was widely believed, though never conclusively proven in a court of law, that he had effectively co-opted significant portions of the Mexican Federal Judicial Police, the Army's high command, and the political establishment at the highest levels. His reach seemed limitless, his power absolute. He was no longer just a drug lord, he was a parallel state, a sovereign entity whose laws were enforced not by courts, but by the absolute certainty of violent retribution. He lived in a world of his own creation, a gilded cage of unimaginable power and paranoia, where every shadow held a potential threat, and every whispered conversation could be a prelude to betrayal. The empire of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, built with such breathtaking speed and audacity, was not a monolithic fortress, but a complex web of alliances and simmering rivalries, all held together by the sheer force of his will, his strategic genius, and the pervasive fear he instilled. To understand his reign is to understand the constant state of war that defined the Mexican drug trade in the 1990s, a brutal contest for routes, for political influence, and for ultimate supremacy. While his business relationship with the Colombian Cali cartel was the cornerstone of his wealth, his most immediate and deadly threats came from within Mexico, from the other cartels born from the ashes of Felix Gallardo's empire. The most ferocious of these conflicts was with the Tijuana cartel, led by the ruthless and volatile Arellano Felix brothers. The animosity was personal, deep-seated, and rooted in a betrayal that occurred before Amado's ascent to the throne of Juarez. The story, as often told in the underworld, involved Amado's younger brother, Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes. The details are murky, shrouded in the code of silence that governs such affairs, but it is believed that Rodolfo had been involved with Nadina Arellano Felix, the sister of the Tijuana bosses. The relationship soared, culminating in a violent incident where Rodolfo was severely beaten by the Arellano Felix brothers, an act of profound disrespect that Amado, a man for whom family was paramount, could never forgive. This personal vendetta became a bloody war between two of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet. The battle was not fought on traditional battlefields, but in the streets of Mexican cities, in nightclubs, and on highways. The Arellano Felix brothers, known for their flamboyant brutality, attempted a strike that would shock the world and demonstrate their reach. In May of 1993, they dispatched a team of assassins to the Guadalajara airport, intending to kill Amado Carrillo Fuentes himself. The intelligence was flawed. Amado was not on the flight they expected. Instead, their hit squad mistakenly intercepted a vehicle carrying Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, a high-ranking Catholic archbishop. In a hail of over 40 bullets, the cardinal was killed, along with 6 others. The assassination of a prince of the church sent seismic waves through Mexican society and politics, drawing an unprecedented level of scrutiny from the international community and forcing the Mexican government to appear to take action. While the Arellano Felix brothers were widely blamed, the event cast a shadow over all the cartels, including Amado's. It was a stark reminder that the violence they cultivated could spiral beyond their control, threatening the very foundations of the state that they so heavily corrupted. This event forced Amado further into the shadows, making him even more cautious, more security obsessed. The war with Tijuana was just one front. To the south, in his home state of Sinaloa, a new alliance was rising, one that would eventually eclipse all others, the Sinaloa Cartel, led by the cunning and ambitious Joe O'Clean, El Chapo, Guzman, along with Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada. Initially, there was a degree of cooperation, a recognition of their shared Sinaloan heritage and a common enemy in the Tijuana group. Amado, for a time, even allowed El Chapo to use his prized Juarez corridor to move product for a hefty fee, of course, but this was always a tense, fragile arrangement. El Chapo was a natural-born rival, a man of immense ambition who would not forever be content with paying tolls to another. Amado understood this intrinsically. His strategy was not to engage in a direct, all-out war on every front, but to manage these conflicts through a combination of overwhelming force, strategic alliances, and his unparalleled financial power. He would occasionally form temporary pacts with one enemy to neutralize another, playing the complex, deadly game of narcotics chess with a master's touch. He fortified his home turf of Ciudad Juarez, turning it into a fortress city where his law was absolute. The violence was horrific. Bodies would appear daily, mutilated and displayed with messages, a gruesome form of communication between the warring factions. Yet, through it all, Amado himself remained a ghost, a name whispered more often than a man seen. He moved between safe houses constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. He trusted only a small, inner circle, primarily his brothers Rodolfo and Vicente. His personal security detail was a small army in itself, comprised of former Mexican Special Forces soldiers, the so-called Zetas, who would later become a cartel in their own right, and he paid them fortunes to ensure their loyalty. He lived in a state of perpetual, hyper-vigilant paranoia, knowing that his immense success had made him the #1 target for the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the Mexican government, and every rival who coveted his throne. The pressure was immense, a constant, crushing weight that came with every $billion shipment, every corrupted general, and every body left in the street. He was at the pinnacle of his power, the undisputed lord of the skies. But the higher he flew, the more he must have realized how devastating the fall would be. The air at that altitude was thin, and the enemies were circling, waiting for the first sign of weakness. The immense pressure, the constant threat of assassination, and the relentless pursuit by authorities began to forge a new, desperate plan in the mind of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. By 1997, the walls were closing in. The Clinton administration in the United States had made him their prime international target, and the pressure on the Mexican government of President Ernesto Zedillo to capture or kill him was immense and unrelenting. His once impenetrable shield of corruption was showing cracks. High-level arrests and the flipping of key lieutenants under the threat of extradition to the United States meant that his network of protection was becoming compromised. He could feel the gaze of his enemies tightening, the news of a multi-national manhunt slowly constricting around him. It was in this atmosphere of escalating paranoia and strategic necessity that he conceived of his most audacious scheme yet, one that dwarfed even the acquisition of his fleet of jets. He would not merely hide, he would cease to exist. Amado Carrillo Fuentes would vanish, and in his place, a new man with a new face would emerge, free to enjoy his billions in anonymous peace, untouchable by the law and unrecognizable to his rivals. This was the genesis of the plan for a comprehensive physical transformation, a radical plastic surgery procedure so extensive it would erase every recognizable feature of the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere. He assembled a team of medical professionals, led by a highly respected plastic surgeon from a prestigious Mexico City hospital. The doctor, along with a team of anesthesiologists and nurses, was offered a fee rumored to be in the millions of dollars, an offer that, in the world Amado ruled, was impossible to refuse. The plan was meticulously detailed. The procedures would be performed in the absolute secrecy of a private wing of the Santa Monica Hospital in Mexico City, a facility he effectively controlled through a combination of bribery and intimidation. The suite was converted into a state-of-the-art surgical theater, equipped to handle any complication. The list of planned alterations was exhaustive: rhinoplasty to reshape his nose, blepharoplasty to change the shape of his eyes, a forehead lift, cheekbone reduction, liposuction to alter his jawline and body shape, and even procedures to change his fingerprints. It was an attempt at total erasure, a medical vanishing act. In early July of 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes checked into the hospital under an assumed name. The atmosphere was one of extreme tension and secrecy. His personal guards, heavily armed and intensely loyal, secured the entire floor, allowing no one in or out without his direct authorization. The medical team, understandably terrified, knew the stakes. Success would mean a wealthy retirement. Failure would mean certain death. On the operating table, under the bright lights, the man who had built an empire began to be systematically dismantled, piece by piece, feature by feature. The initial stages of the marathon surgery were reported to have been successful. However, as the complex procedures stretched on for hours, a catastrophic event occurred. The official version of events, later released by the Mexican Attorney General's office, states that Amado Carrillo Fuentes suffered a fatal heart attack on the operating table. The cause was attributed to a combination of factors: the immense physiological stress of the prolonged surgery, a possible adverse reaction to the cocktail of powerful anesthetics, specifically doliprane, a drug not approved for use in the United States, and his alleged abuse of cocaine in the hours leading up to the operation, which could have placed an unbearable strain on his cardiovascular system. When he went into cardiac arrest, the medical team, in a state of panic, attempted frantic resuscitation efforts, but they were unsuccessful. The Lord of the Skies was declared dead in the early morning hours of July 4th, 1997. The news, when it began to leak, sent a shockwave through the criminal underworld and the law enforcement agencies that had pursued him. The initial reaction from nearly every quarter was one of profound skepticism. How could the most powerful, most cautious, and most elusive drug lord in the world die in something as mundane as a botched plastic surgery operation? It seemed too convenient, too perfect, too much like a final masterstroke of deception. Conspiracy theories erupted instantly. Some speculated that he had indeed died, but had been murdered on the table, either by a rival who had infiltrated his security, or by the doctors themselves under orders from a government agency. Others believed it was all an elaborate hoax, that he had paid the doctors to fake his death, that the body in the coffin was a look-alike, and that the real Amado was living in luxurious anonymity in a remote corner of the world, perhaps in Chile, Russia, or South Africa. The circumstances surrounding the body only fueled these theories. The story put forth by his family and his organization was that, in accordance with his wishes for his new identity, his body had been immediately embalmed and sealed in a metal coffin before any official identification or autopsy could be performed by independent authorities. When the coffin was finally opened for a visual identification by a Mexican judge days later, the body inside was reportedly so badly disfigured by the failed surgery and the chemical effects of the embalming fluid that it was nearly unrecognizable. The man who had spent his life cultivating invisibility had, in death, achieved a final, grotesque form of it. The official confirmation of his identity came through a fingerprint match, but even this was viewed with suspicion by many. The stage was set for one of the greatest mysteries in the history of organized crime. Did Amado Carrillo Fuentes truly die in a Mexico City hospital, or did the Lord of the Skies execute one final, perfect flight into the unknown? The immediate aftermath of Amado Carrillo Fuentes' reported death was a chaotic vacuum of power, a violent scramble for the throne he had left seemingly empty. The news, whether true or fabricated, did not bring peace to the drug trade. It ignited a conflagration that would burn for decades. The Juarez Cartel, once a monolithic entity under Amado's iron-fisted control, began to fracture from within. The natural successors were his brothers, Rodolfo and Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. Rodolfo, known as El Niño de Oro, or the Golden Boy, was said to be more hot-headed and less strategically gifted than his older brother. Vicente was considered the more pragmatic of the two. Together, they attempted to hold the empire together, but they lacked Amado's unparalleled logistical genius, his deep-rooted connections within the government and military, and the aura of invincibility that had kept so many rivals and subordinates in check. The first and most devastating challenge came from their former, temporary allies, Joaquin, El Chapo. Guzman and the Sinaloa cartel saw the moment of transition as a golden opportunity to seize control of the prized Juarez Plaza, the most valuable smuggling corridor in the world. The gentleman's agreement, the tolls that El Chapo had paid to Amado, were now null and void. What followed was not merely a war, it was a slaughterhouse, a descent into a level of barbarism that would make the previous decades of cartel violence seem almost tame by comparison. The city of Ciudad Juarez, already hardened by its border town existence, was transformed into a killing field, earning the grim title of the most violent city in the world not at war. The battle for the plaza was fought with a new and terrifying vocabulary of violence. Public massacres at birthday parties and rehab centers became commonplace. Bodies were hung from bridges. Decapitated heads were rolled onto dance floors, and narcomantis message-laden banners taunted rivals and authorities alike. The Sinaloa cartel employed sicarios, or hitmen, who were younger, more ruthless, and often addicted to the very drugs they were fighting over. The Carrillo Fuentes organization, now known as the Vicente Carrillo Fuentes Cartel or the Juarez Cartel, responded in kind. The violence was not contained to the criminals. It bled into every facet of society. Journalists were murdered for their reporting. Police chiefs were assassinated within hours of taking office. And ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted to sow terror. The sheer scale of the carnage was a direct result of Amado's absence. He had been a stabilizing force, a monopolist who, through sheer power and efficiency, had imposed a kind of brutal order on the chaos. His death shattered that order, unleashing the pent-up ambitions of every rival and subordinate who had been waiting for their chance. Beyond the Sinaloa threat, other factions began to break away. The Gulf Cartel, with its enforcement arm, the Zetas, many of whom were former Mexican Special Forces soldiers who had once been on Amado's payroll, saw an opportunity to expand their territory. The Beltran, Leyva organization, once aligned with Sinaloa, also entered the fray, forming and breaking alliances in a dizzying, deadly dance. The Mexican government, under President Felipe Calderon, who declared a war on the cartels in 2006, poured tens of thousands of soldiers and federal police into the fight. But this often had the effect of further destabilizing the balance of power, removing capos and creating even more violent succession struggles. The corruption that Amado had so masterfully engineered now became more diffuse, more competitive, and ultimately more volatile. Different cartels bought different police forces and different army units, turning the state's security apparatus into a fractured collection of armed groups fighting proxy wars for their criminal patrons. The legend of Amado Carrillo Fuentes began to grow in death, mythologized by the very chaos he had once kept at bay. His name became a symbol of a bygone era, a time when one man, however brutal, could control the storm. For the people of Juarez and for Mexico, the years following his death were a bloody testament to the fact that the king was truly gone. The empire had not peacefully passed to an heir. It had been thrown into a gladiatorial pit, and the entire nation was forced to witness the gruesome spectacle. The downfall of the Juarez Cartel, from its pinnacle under Amado to a blood-soaked shadow of its former self, was swift and merciless. A classic tale of how the absence of a single, dominant figure can unleash forces of destruction that ultimately consume the very kingdom they fought to control. The enduring mystery of Amado Carrillo Fuentes' true fate, a puzzle wrapped in the enigma of his own meticulously constructed secrecy, refused to die with the official pronouncement from the Mexican government. In the weeks, months, and years that followed that early July morning in 1997, a torrent of evidence, rumors, and conspiracy theories flooded the void left by his disappearance, each piece of information scrutinized for the ultimate truth. The official narrative, presented by the Mexican Attorney General's office, was riddled with inconsistencies that fueled immediate and lasting doubt. The handling of the body was the first and most significant red flag. The claim that his corpse had been embalmed and sealed in a metal coffin within hours of his death before a proper, independent autopsy could be performed struck many as a convenient way to avoid scientific scrutiny. When the coffin was finally opened for a visual identification by a judge, the description of the body was horrifying and, for identification purposes, nearly useless. Reports stated the face was massively swollen, the skin a greenish, black hue, and the features distorted beyond recognition by both the failed surgery and the harsh chemicals used in the embalming process. The positive identification, officials claimed, was made by matching fingerprints from the corpse to those on file for Amado. Yet, this too was met with skepticism. Could fingerprints not be altered? Or could a body not be swapped in the controlled environment of his own hospital? The story of the medical team further deepened the shadows. The lead plastic surgeon, Dr. George Reyes Altepez, and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Carlos S. Mano, along with several nurses, vanished shortly after the procedure. For weeks, their whereabouts were unknown. Then, in a gruesome discovery that seemed ripped from a cartel thriller, their bodies were found stuffed into steel drums, which had been left on a roadside near the Mexico City airport. The bodies showed signs of severe torture. The message was clear and classic cartel silence. But who had ordered the hit? If Amado was truly dead, who felt the need to eliminate the doctors? Some speculated it was his brothers, Rodolfo and Vicente, seeking revenge for the botched surgery that killed their brother. Others theorized it was Amado himself, tying up the one loose end that could reveal his survival and new identity. The doctor's murders did not clarify the situation. They plunged it into even deeper darkness. Then came the flood of alleged sightings, each one more fantastical than the last. He was seen living on a vast, secluded ranch in Patagonia, Chile. He was reported to be in Russia, protected by the oligarchs, whose rise mirrored his own brand of ruthless capitalism. He was said to be living as a quiet, wealthy businessman in South Africa, or even in a compound somewhere in the United States, protected by the very agencies that had once hunted him in exchange for information. These stories were fueled by the sheer improbability of his death. How could a man who had evaded the DEA, the CIA, the Mexican army, and countless rivals for so many years, a man whose paranoia was legendary, place his life so completely in the hands of a few doctors? It seemed a flaw out of character for the master strategist. A reckless mistake that the meticulous Lord of the Skies would never have made. His legendary wealth also played into the theories. While the Mexican government seized hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, ranches, houses, cars, and businesses, the vast majority of his fortune, estimated to be in the tens of billions, simply vanished. This was not money that could be easily hidden in a few bank accounts. It was a vast financial empire. If he had planned his death, he would have also planned the transfer and laundering of this fortune to fund his new life. The alternative, that this immense wealth was simply lost or absorbed by his organization in the chaotic war that followed, seemed almost as unlikely as his survival. For every piece of evidence supporting his death, there was a counterpoint suggesting an elaborate ruse. The body was unidentifiable. The doctors were murdered. The money was gone. The death was too convenient, too perfectly timed as the pressure from the United States reached its zenith. The myth of Amado Carrillo Fuentes had always been larger than the man, and in the absence of a verifiable, incontrovertible truth, the myth expanded to fill the space, creating a legend of a criminal Icarus who did not fall from the sky, but who flew into the sun and simply disappeared. Beyond the immediate mystery of his death, the true legacy of Amado Carrillo Fuentes lies in the profound and permanent blueprint he created for the modern Mexican drug cartel, a model of operation that his successors and rivals would emulate, refine, and escalate to even more terrifying heights. He was the prototype of the 21st century narcotics kingpin, a quantum leap from the traditional, locally focused padrinos of the past. His most revolutionary innovation was the conceptual shift from being a producer to being a logistics master. Before Amado, the Mexican traffickers were often partners or subcontractors to the Colombians. Important but not dominant, Amado flipped this dynamic on its head by offering a full service transportation package. He effectively made the Colombians his clients, not his bosses. This established the Mexican cartels as the indispensable middlemen, the gatekeepers to the world's most profitable drug market. This model generated unprecedented wealth and, more importantly, strategic leverage. It decentralized the trade's power structure, moving the critical choke point from the jungles of South America to the smuggling routes of Mexico. A shift that would ultimately make the Mexican cartels more powerful and wealthy than their Colombian predecessors ever were. His second monumental contribution was the corporatization of corruption. While bribery had always existed, Amado industrialized it. He didn't just pay off a few local police chiefs. He systematically targeted and compromised the highest echelons of power. He understood that to move tons of cocaine in commercial airliners, he needed not just blind eyes, but active assistance from the very institutions tasked with stopping him. This meant corrupting generals in the Mexican army, directors of federal police agencies, high-ranking politicians, and officials in the Attorney General's office. He created a parallel state, a shadow government whose jurisdiction was the entirety of his smuggling empire. This legacy of high-level, systemic corruption is perhaps his most enduring and damaging contribution to Mexico, creating a cynicism and distrust in public institutions that persists to this day. It set a new standard for all cartels that followed to achieve true power. You must not just evade the state, you must own a significant part of it. His third legacy was in the realm of operational security and public persona. In an era where other kingpins, like Pablo Escobar, reveled in their notoriety, building public housing and running for political office, Amado was a ghost. He was the first mega capo to fully understand the strategic value of invisibility. He gave no interviews, was photographed only a handful of times, and cultivated an aura of mystery that was itself a form of armor. This low-profile, corporate-style leadership became the new model. Figures like Ismael El Mayo, Zambada of the Sinaloa cartel, would later perfect this style, becoming near mythical figures whose power was undeniable, but whose faces were unknown. Amado demonstrated that the most effective kingpin was not a flamboyant folk hero, but a silent, ruthless CEO whose name was whispered, not shouted. Finally, his use of technology and sophisticated finance set a new bar. The fleet of Boeing 727s was not just a bold stunt. It was a testament to his willingness to leverage advanced technology for criminal ends. He didn't just use planes. He used the global financial system with equal skill. His money laundering operations were sprawling and complex, involving real estate, front companies, and international banking networks that were years ahead of the authorities trying to track them. He showed that to operate on a global scale, a cartel needed its own treasury department, its own logistics division, and its own human resources office for hiring pilots and assassins alike. This corporatization of violence and logistics meant that the cartel was no longer just a family or a gang. It was a multinational, illicit conglomerate with a diversified portfolio of criminal activities. When his empire fractured after his death, these blueprints did not disappear. They were picked up by every aspiring capo. The Sinaloa Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas, the Juarez Cartel, all of them operated on the fundamental business model that Amado pioneered. Control the logistics, corrupt the state, maintain a low profile, and leverage technology. The violence that engulfed Mexico in the 2000s and beyond was, in many ways, the result of multiple organizations, all built in Amado's image, fighting for the spoils of the system he had perfected. He was the criminal visionary who saw the future of the drug trade, and in building that future, he unleashed forces that would forever change the social and political landscape of his nation. His legacy is not just the legend of the Lord of the Skies, but the very architecture of the hyper-violent, sophisticated, and deeply entrenched criminal enterprises that continue to challenge the Mexican state today. To truly grasp the colossal scale of the empire Amado Carrillo Fuentes built, one must move beyond the abstract notions of power and delve into the tangible, almost unimaginable manifestations of his wealth. The fortune he accumulated was not merely numbers in a ledger. It was a physical force that reshaped landscapes, corrupted entire sectors of the economy, and funded a lifestyle of such opulent secrecy that it became the stuff of legend. Estimates from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and other intelligence agencies placed his weekly income at a staggering 200 to 300 million during the peak of his operations in the mid-1990s. To put that into perspective, that is more than the annual budget of a mid-sized city generated every single week. This relentless tsunami of cash created a problem unique to his organization, not how to make money, but how to store it, move it, and most importantly, cleanse it of its illicit origins so it could enter the legitimate world. The logistics of his money laundering were as sophisticated as the logistics of his drug smuggling. He employed a small army of financial experts, accountants, and lawyers who established a dizzying network of shell companies and front businesses across Mexico, the United States, the Caribbean, and Europe. These companies, with innocuous names dealing in everything from import, export, and real estate to agriculture and manufacturing, served as vessels to commingle his dirty money with clean revenue. Vast sums were funneled into the purchase of commercial real estate in Mexico City, luxurious resorts in Acapulco, and prime property in cities like El Paso and Houston. He owned fleets of trucks, shopping centers, and even a significant portion of a Mexican airline, further embedding his wealth into the legitimate economy. The sheer volume of cash was so overwhelming that it is rumored his operatives would use industrial scale currency counting machines. And there were stories of warehouses where billions of dollars in cash were stored, with the sheer weight of the money causing structural damage to the buildings. This physical cash also had to be moved, and this was often done in convoys of armored trucks, disguised as bank transports, moving from counting houses to banks or across the border. The corruption required to facilitate this was monumental. He didn't just bribe bank managers. He allegedly bought entire banks, using their infrastructure to wire billions of dollars around the world with a veneer of legitimacy. His personal spending was equally epic, though characteristically discreet. He did not flaunt his wealth like a trophy. He deployed it as a tool for security and comfort. His primary residence in Juárez, known as La Casana, was a sprawling, unassuming fortress from the outside, but inside it was a palace fitted with the most advanced security systems, panic rooms, and tunnels for escape. He owned a collection of ranches across northern Mexico that served dual purposes. They were luxurious retreats and operational bases with their own private airstrips. One of his most famous properties was a massive ranch in the state of Jalisco, which featured a private zoo, a bull ring, and multiple mansions. His taste in vehicles was just as expansive. He owned a fleet of armored Suburbans, luxury sedans, and even bulletproof versions of expensive sports cars, all registered to his labyrinth of shell companies to avoid detection. When he traveled, it was with a security detail that resembled a presidential motorcade, comprising dozens of vehicles filled with heavily armed bodyguards, many of them former members of the Mexican Army's elite special forces. He was known to throw parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But these were not public spectacles. They were private gatherings for his inner circle, held in secured compounds where guests were thoroughly vetted. He would pay top dollar for the finest musicians, the most exclusive caterers, and the rarest liquors, creating a bubble of extreme luxury that was completely insulated from the outside world. Yet, even within this gilded cage, his paranoia was ever present. He is said to have employed food tasters to guard against poison and to have never used the same phone twice. The psychological toll of living as both a king and a prisoner was immense. The man who could buy anything in the world could not buy the one thing he truly needed: peace of mind. His wealth was a monument to his power, but it was also his anchor, weighing him down, making him a target, and forcing him into a life of constant vigilance and isolation. The billions of dollars were not just a reward for his success. They were the fuel for his paranoia, and the very reason the walls were closing in, leading him to that fateful decision to erase his own identity in a desperate bid for the freedom his money could not otherwise provide. The intricate and deeply personal relationships within Amado Carrillo Fuentes' inner circle, particularly his bond with his family, were not merely a side note to his criminal saga. They were the very bedrock of his empire, the source of his strength, and ultimately a critical vulnerability in the treacherous, ever-shifting world of high-stakes trafficking, where alliances were forged and broken with the volatility of desert lightning. Blood was supposed to be the one constant, the unbreakable bond upon which absolute trust could be built. Amado was, by all accounts, a deeply family-oriented man, a patriarch who leveraged his success to elevate his entire clan, placing them in positions of immense power and responsibility within his organization. His brothers were his most trusted lieutenants. Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, El Niño de Oro, was a key operational figure, often managing sensitive logistics and acting as Amado's representative in high-stakes meetings. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, quieter and more reserved, was also deeply involved, learning the intricacies of the business at his older brother's side. This nepotism was a double-edged sword. It ensured a core of loyalty that was immune to financial temptation from rivals, but it also meant that the fate of the entire empire was tied to the capabilities and actions of his relatives. The loyalty was fierce and unquestioned, but it was this very loyalty that ignited one of the most brutal and defining conflicts of his reigns, the war with the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel. The origins of this feud, as previously mentioned, were intensely personal, rooted in the perceived disrespect shown to his brother Rodolfo. Amado's response was not that of a detached CEO assessing a business risk. It was the fury of a family patriarch defending the honor of his kin. This personal vendetta escalated into a nationwide cartel war that cost thousands of lives and drew unprecedented law enforcement attention, demonstrating how family ties could override cold, strategic calculus. Beyond his brothers, Amado's romantic life was also complex and strategically significant. He was married to María de los Ángeles Sáenz Budimia, with whom he had several children. Yet, he also had a long-term relationship with a woman named Hildehern Endez de la Sancha, who was known by the nickname La Tutti. These relationships were guarded with the same intensity as his operational secrets. His wives and children lived lives of extreme luxury, but also of extreme confinement, shuttling between heavily fortified safe houses, their lives a paradox of immense wealth and profound lack of freedom. They were his ultimate vulnerability, potential targets for rivals seeking to inflict the deepest possible wound. This constant threat necessitated that his family live in a state of near imprisonment within their golden cages, their every movement monitored and controlled by his security apparatus. The protection of his family was a non-negotiable priority that consumed vast resources and strategic attention. Furthermore, his network extended to a vast web of cousins, uncles, and in-laws who were integrated into the financial and logistical wings of the cartel, handling money laundering, managing front companies, and overseeing legitimate investments. This created a clan-based corporate structure that was difficult for outsiders to infiltrate, but also susceptible to collapse if the central pillar was removed. The reliance on family also had a darker, more ruthless side. The trust placed in his brothers meant that when Amado reportedly died, the succession was a foregone conclusion within the organization, but it was also a catastrophic failure. Rodolfo and Vicente, while capable lieutenants, did not possess Amado's visionary genius, his diplomatic cunning, or his unparalleled ability to corrupt at the highest levels. The empire began to fracture almost immediately under their command, precisely because it was so personalized around Amado himself. The family bond that had been its greatest strength became its greatest weakness in his absence. The story of his immediate family after his death is a tragic epilogue to his reign. Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, El Niño de Oro, was assassinated in a spectacularly brazen attack at a movie theater in Culiacan in 2004. The hit was widely attributed to the Sinaloa cartel, a brutal punctuation mark in the war for the Juarez Plaza. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes took over sole leadership and struggled for years to hold the crumbling empire together against the relentless assault from Sinaloa and other rivals. He was eventually captured by Mexican authorities in 2014, ending the direct reign of the Carrillo Fuentes dynasty over the cartel that bore their name. The children and wives of Amado were forced into even deeper hiding, their lives defined by the immense, tainted inheritance of a father and husband who was either a ghost or a corpse. The family that Amado sought to elevate and protect was ultimately scattered, hunted, and destroyed by the very world he had built for them. His story serves as a grim lesson in the narcotics trade, that while family can provide the strongest foundation for an empire, it also creates the most emotionally charged and vulnerable points of failure, ensuring that the personal and the professional are forever intertwined in a deadly dance, and that the sins of the father are invariably visited upon the children, leaving a legacy not of honor, but of blood and sorrow. The operational machinery of the Juarez Cartel under Amado Carrillo Fuentes was a masterpiece of criminal engineering, a complex and multi-layered organization that functioned with the efficiency of a major corporation and the lethal precision of a paramilitary force. To view it as a simple gang of smugglers would be a profound misunderstanding. It was a vertically integrated transnational enterprise with specialized departments, a clear chain of command, and a strategic vision that spanned continents. At the very top sat Amado, the chief executive officer and sole visionary, whose word was absolute law. Directly beneath him was his inner circle, a tight, knit group comprised primarily of his blood relatives, including his brothers Rodolfo and Vicente, who oversaw major geographical plazas and critical logistical operations. This inner sanctum was the strategic command, making decisions about alliances, major financial investments, and declarations of war. Below this tier was the layer of lieutenants, the jefes de plaza, who were the regional managers of key cities and smuggling routes. These were powerful, trusted individuals responsible for all criminal activity in their territory, the transportation and storage of narcotics, the collection of revenue, the distribution of payments to corrupt officials, and the enforcement of the cartel's will. A crucial and highly specialized wing reported directly to these lieutenants, the financial arm. This department was staffed by lawyers, accountants, and bankers whose sole purpose was to launder the billions of dollars in cash generated by the drug trade. They operated the network of shell companies, front businesses, and currency exchange houses that formed a global web for cleaning the money and reinvesting it into both legitimate and illicit assets. This financial apparatus was the lifeblood of the entire operation, funding the massive payroll, the astronomical bribes, and the luxurious lifestyles of the leadership. Parallel to this was the logistics and transportation division, the very heart of Amado's innovation. This was not a single unit, but a collection of highly specialized teams. There were the aviation experts, the pilots, navigators, and ground crews who managed the fleet of Boeing 727s and other aircraft. There were the maritime specialists who coordinated shipments via container ships and fast boats. There were the land-based transporters who managed the fleets of trucks, cars, and trains used to move product across the U.S. border. Each of these teams operated with a high degree of autonomy and secrecy to maintain operational security, aware that the failure of one link could compromise the entire chain. Then there was the most feared element of the organization, the enforcement arm. This was the cartel's muscle, its internal police and external army. It was composed of sicarios, or hitmen, who were organized into cells. Some were local recruits from the impoverished neighborhoods of Juárez, eager for money and power. Others were far more professional and terrifying former members of the Mexican Army's Special Forces, particularly the GFS Grupo Aerom Vil de Fuerzas Especiales, who were lured away by salaries that dwarfed their military pay. These highly trained soldiers brought military-grade tactics, weaponry, and discipline to the cartel's violent operations. They were responsible for protecting drug shipments, intimidating rivals, executing traitors within the organization, and waging the brutal war against the Tijuana and Sinaloa cartels. They were the ones who carried out the public displays of violence, the hangings, the decapitations, the narcomantas, that served as psychological warfare against both enemies and the general population. Beyond these core departments, the cartel also maintained a vast network of corrupt contacts. A shadow human resources department that managed the payroll for a seemingly endless list of compromised individuals. This included local, state, and federal police officers, commanders and soldiers in the Mexican army, customs officials at airports and border crossings, politicians, and even journalists who were paid to report favorably or to remain silent. This network was not static. It required constant maintenance, renegotiation, and, when necessary, violent reinforcement. The entire organization was structured like a series of concentric circles, with Amado at the impenetrable center. The inner circles were built on blood and long-standing trust, while the outer layers were motivated by money and fear. Communication was tightly controlled, often using complex code words and a constantly rotating system of cell phones to evade wiretaps. The structure was designed to be resilient. If one cell was captured or killed, it could be isolated and replaced without bringing down the entire enterprise. This corporate, militarized structure, perfected by Amado Carrillo Fuentes, became the gold standard for every major cartel that followed. It was no longer enough to be a brave smuggler. To be a kingpin, one had to be a skilled executive, a strategic logistician, a financial wizard, and a ruthless general all at once. Amado was the first to embody this complete package, and the organization he built was a dark mirror of a Fortune 500 company. Its products were addiction and violence, and its bottom line was measured in blood and billions. The relentless pursuit of Amado Carrillo Fuentes by the United States government, particularly the Drug Enforcement Administration, represents one of the most extensive and determined international manhunts of the late 20th century. A high-stakes chess match between a seemingly untouchable criminal phantom and a formidable federal agency pushed to its operational limits. For the DEA, Amado was not just another high-value target. He was the ultimate prize, the architect of a new, more sophisticated, and more dangerous era of drug trafficking that directly threatened American national security. The sheer volume of cocaine his organization pumped across the border was unprecedented, fueling a public health crisis and waves of violence in American cities. The DEA's strategy was multi-pronged and aggressive, leveraging every tool at its disposal. From traditional street-level informants to advanced electronic surveillance and high-level international diplomacy. Agents working out of the El Paso Intelligence Center, a multi-agency hub focused on the border, dedicated their careers to piecing together the shadowy puzzle of his empire. They pursued leads on his fleet of aircraft, tracking purchases of Boeing 727s through a labyrinth of shell corporations in Panama and the Caribbean. They followed the money trail, working with the Treasury Department to identify and freeze his assets, though this often felt like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble given the sheer scale and complexity of his financial networks. They cultivated informants within his organization, a perilous endeavor that often ended with the informant's gruesome death. Their mutilated bodies serving as a stark warning to others who might consider cooperation. The pressure from Washington was immense. The Clinton administration had declared the fight against international drug cartels a top priority, and the capture of the Lord of the Skies became a symbol of that commitment. This political will translated into unprecedented cooperation and at times tension with Mexican authorities. The DEA provided intelligence, training, and resources to their Mexican counterparts in the PJF, the Federal Judicial Police. However, this partnership was perpetually poisoned by the very corruption Amado had so expertly cultivated. DEA agents often found their most sensitive information and carefully laid plans were mysteriously compromised. Their targets warned, their operations sabotaged from within. They were not just fighting a cartel. They were fighting a parallel government that Amado had built inside the Mexican state. This created an atmosphere of profound frustration and mistrust, where American agents knew that any intelligence shared with certain Mexican agencies would likely find its way directly to Amado's desk. The most significant lever the United States possessed was the threat of extradition. For Amado and his top lieutenants, the prospect of standing trial in an American courtroom, far from their corrupted power base, was the ultimate nightmare. American prisons offered no luxury, no control, and no possibility of a negotiated peace with the authorities. This fear of extradition is what ultimately led to the downfall of many of his contemporaries, and is considered by many analysts to be the primary motivator behind Amado's desperate plan for plastic surgery. He wasn't just trying to hide from the DEA. He was trying to create a new identity that could never be linked to the old one, thereby erasing the legal basis for his extradition forever. The manhunt reached a fever pitch in 1997. The DEA felt they were closer than ever, with several key investigations converging. They had made inroads into his financial operations and were actively tracking his key lieutenants. The net was tightening, and Amado could feel it. The news of his death in July of that year was, therefore, met with a mixture of professional frustration and deep-seated skepticism within the DEA. While the Mexican government quickly closed the case, many American agents believed it was an elaborate hoax. They continued to investigate leads and alleged sightings for years, chasing shadows across the globe, convinced that the master criminal had executed one final, perfect deception. For the dedicated agents who had spent years of their lives chasing his ghost, his disappearance, whether through death or vanishing, was an unsatisfying and inconclusive end to the hunt. They were denied the closure of a capture, a trial, and a conviction. The legacy of their pursuit is a testament to the immense challenge of combating a criminal enterprise that had so thoroughly infiltrated the institutions meant to stop it. The battle against Amado Carrillo Fuentes was not just a war of arrests and seizures. It was a battle against a corrosive idea that the power of money could systematically dismantle the rule of law, and for a long, terrifying period, under the vast, dark skies he called his own, it seemed like he was winning. The figure of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, existing in the liminal space between documented history and enduring legend, has undergone a profound transformation in the decades since his disappearance, evolving from a feared narcotics kingpin into a pervasive cultural icon, a symbol whose meaning shifts depending on the lens through which he is viewed. This myth-making process began even during his lifetime, fueled by the very secrecy he cultivated. The name LC or de los Cielos itself is a powerful piece of mythology, evoking an almost supernatural figure who commanded the heavens, a modern day Icarus whose wings, however, were jet engines. His story, with its elements of immense wealth, ultimate power, and a mysterious vanishing act, contains all the archetypal ingredients of a classic tragedy or a folk epic, albeit one written in blood and cocaine. In the impoverished colonias of Mexico, particularly in his home state of Sinaloa, a complex and troubling form of folklore emerged around him. For some, he became a modern-day Robin Hood figure, a narrative often constructed around drug lords who flash their wealth and distribute crumbs of it to their local communities, while Amado was far too discreet for such public philanthropy. The legend of his boundless wealth and his ability to defy the gringos to the north and a corrupt government in Mexico City resonated with those who felt disenfranchised by both. He represented a perverted form of success, a man who seized a kingdom through sheer force of will, creating his own rules and his own justice in a system that offered few legitimate opportunities for ascent. This cultural narrative was powerfully amplified and disseminated through the genre of narco-corridos, folk ballads that tell the stories of drug traffickers. These songs, played on radio stations and at parties across northern Mexico, are a potent form of contemporary folklore, blending fact and fiction to create heroic, often tragic, figures out of violent criminals. Amado Carrillo Fuentes became a central character in this musical canon. Corridos like El Señor de los Cielos immortalized his exploits, his fleets of planes, his evasion of authorities, his immense power. The lyrics rarely focused on the victims of his trade or the societal devastation it caused. Instead, they celebrated his audacity, his wealth, and his Sinaloan roots, cementing his status as a folk hero for a segment of the population. This cultural phenomenon demonstrates how criminal achievement can be twisted into a form of rebellious pride, a dangerous glamorization that continues to lure young men into the cartel lifestyle with the promise of glory and respect. Beyond folk music, his legend has permeated mainstream global culture. His life has been the subject of countless books, documentary series, and, most notably, the wildly popular television drama El C or de los Cielos, which, while fictionalized, has introduced his alias and the broad strokes of his story to millions of viewers across the world. In this portrayal, he is often depicted as a charismatic, intelligent, and complex anti-hero, a characterization that further blurs the line between ruthless criminal and romantic outlaw. The very mystery of his death provides the perfect, open-ended canvas for these fictional explorations, allowing writers and audiences to imagine a dozen different endings for the kingpin who simply disappeared. This cultural absorption serves to sanitize and dramatize the brutal reality of his empire. The gruesome murders, the corrupted institutions, the countless lives destroyed by addiction and violence are often pushed into the background, replaced by a focus on the glamorous, high-stakes world of private jets and secret identities. The man who lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear is transformed into a cool, collected mastermind. The psychological toll of his life is erased in favor of a narrative of untouchable power. The enduring fascination with Amado Carrillo Fuentes speaks to a deeper human attraction to stories of ultimate power and mysterious ends. He is a Rorschach test. Some see a criminal who got away with it, others a revolutionary who beat the system, and still others a tragic figure who sacrificed his humanity for a throne of gold and cocaine. His legacy, therefore, is not just the criminal blueprint he left behind or the violent war that followed his death. It is also the enduring myth, the story of the Lord of the Skies, a ghost who continues to haunt the collective imagination, a permanent and unsettling part of the modern cultural landscape, a dark star whose light, generated by violence and mystery, continues to flicker long after its source has vanished from sight. To fully comprehend the world that produced Amado Carrillo Fuentes, one must journey back through the fertile, mountainous terrain of Sinaloa, the storied and infamous cradle of Mexican drug trafficking. This region is not merely a location on a map, it is a state of mind, a cultural and historical crucible where geography, poverty, history, and a deeply ingrained spirit of independence conspired to create the perfect environment for the illicit trade to take root and flourish. For generations, the remote Sierras of Sinaloa have been ideal for cultivating opium poppies and marijuana, their isolation providing natural protection from government authorities. This was not initially the work of large cartels, but of rural families and small-scale farmers, known as gomeros, who saw in these forbidden crops a path to economic survival that the arid, challenging land and a distant, often indifferent government could not provide. This was the world Amado was born into in 1956, a world where the drug trade was not an abstract evil, but a local industry, a fact of life. This environment normalized the trade from a young age. It was a business, a profession, albeit a dangerous one. This Sinaloan culture of trafficking is underpinned by a unique code of conduct, a set of unwritten rules often referred to as the Code of the Hills. It values silence, loyalty, respect, and a fierce sense of regional pride. Men from Sinaloa or Sinaloenses who rise in the trade are often given the respectful title of Don, a mark of their status and their adherence to this old world code. This is where Amado learned his first lessons in discretion and the paramount importance of trust within a closed circle. But Sinaloa was more than just a culture. It was a training ground, the Harvard and Yale for a generation of narcotics leaders. The Guadalajara cartel of Miguel Angel F.A. Lix Gallardo, godfather, was largely staffed by Sinaloans, including Amado's own uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. This created a powerful network, a Sinaloan mafia that would eventually fracture and compete, but whose shared origins created a complex web of alliances and rivalries. Amado was a product of this system, but he was also its ultimate evolution. He took the Sinaloan traditions of cultivation and small-scale smuggling and industrialized them on a global scale. He was the bridge between the old school gomeros in the hills and the modern corporate-style capo, moving tons of product through the skies. His success became a point of perverse pride for many in Sinaloa, proof that a man from their soil could become the most powerful trafficker in the world. This cultural context is essential for understanding why the drug trade has been so resilient in Mexico. It is not simply an invasion of criminality. It is, in many ways, an indigenous industry that has metastasized. The poverty and lack of opportunity in regions like Sinaloa provide an endless stream of recruits. Young men who see in the cartels the only path to wealth and respect in a system that has failed them. The narco culture offers not just money, but a sense of identity, power, and belonging. The flashy cars, expensive jewelry, and powerful weapons are potent symbols of success in communities where such symbols are otherwise unattainable. Amado, though he himself was discreet, understood the power of this symbolism. His legend, the very fact that he was the Lord of the Skies, served as a powerful recruitment tool, inspiring a new generation to enter the trade. His story is the ultimate Sinaloan success story, a dark fairy tale where the peasant boy does not become a king in a castle, but a phantom in a palace of his own making, ruling an empire built on a foundation of violence and corruption, yet viewed by some of his countrymen as a perverse form of a self-made man. The culture that created him was then, in turn, reinforced by his monumental success. He proved that the limits of the possible were defined only by one's own ambition and ruthlessness. The Sinaloa cartel, which would eventually be led by his contemporary Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman, would continue to dominate the global drug trade for decades, a testament to the deep roots and formidable resilience of the Sinaloan trafficking tradition. To understand Amado Carrillo Fuentes, then, is to understand that he did not emerge from a vacuum. He was the perfect, logical, and most terrifying product of a specific time and place. A man who took the lessons of his homeland and applied them with a visionary scope, transforming a local illicit trade into a global enterprise, and in doing so, forever etching the name of his home state into the annals of international crime, not as a mere point of origin, but as the spawning ground of emperors. The psychological portrait of Amado Carrillo Fuentes is a complex and chilling study in contrasts, a mind that combined the cold, calculating precision of a corporate strategist with the deep-seated paranoia of a man who knew his immense power was built on a foundation of perpetual betrayal. To envision him as a one-dimensional monster of pure evil is to misunderstand the very nature of his success. His genius lay in a unique and formidable cognitive architecture that allowed him to manage an impossibly complex criminal enterprise while navigating the relentless psychological pressures that came with it. At his core, he was a master logistician and systems thinker. His brain was wired to see the world in terms of networks, supply chains, and points of failure. Where others saw a border, He saw a logistical puzzle to be solved. Where others saw an airport, he saw a hub in his private shipping company. This ability to think on a macro scale, to visualize the entire flow of his product, from the jungles of South America to the streets of the United States, was his primary gift. It was this systems-oriented mind that allowed him to innovate the transportation model, recognizing that controlling the pipeline was more valuable and secure than controlling the production. This was not the impulsive thinking of a thug. It was the strategic planning of a CEO, a mind that could hold vast, interconnected systems in its grasp and optimize them for a single, illicit purpose. Coupled with this was an almost preternatural understanding of human nature, particularly its vulnerabilities. He knew that greed was a more reliable motivator than ideology, and fear was a more powerful tool than persuasion. He built his empire not just on cocaine, but on the systematic exploitation of these twin levers. He identified the specific price for every official, from the lowly border guard to the army general, and he paid it without hesitation. He also understood the absolute necessity of demonstrating the cost of betrayal, which is why his enforcement arm was so brutally efficient. This created a self-perpetuating system where compliance was guaranteed either by the allure of wealth or the terror of a gruesome death. Yet, the man who so expertly manipulated the fears and greed of others was himself a prisoner of his own paranoia. The higher he rose, the more isolated he became. Trust was a currency he could not afford to spend freely. He existed in a state of hyper-vigilance, a constant, draining awareness that every shadow could conceal an assassin, every friendly face could be a traitor, every whispered conversation could be his last. This was not an irrational fear. It was a logical conclusion drawn from the reality of his world. He had risen by betraying and eliminating others, and he knew the same fate awaited him if he let his guard down for even a moment. This paranoia dictated his every move, the constant rotation of safe houses, the army of bodyguards, the food tasters, the discarded phones. It was the tax he paid for his power, a tax that extracted a heavy toll on his humanity. He could never relax, never truly be at peace. The immense wealth that could buy him anything in the world could not buy him a single night of untroubled sleep or a genuine, unguarded conversation. This relentless pressure likely played a significant role in his decision to undergo the radical plastic surgery. It was the ultimate act of a paranoid mind seeking a final solution, not just to his legal problems, but to the psychological torment of being Amado Carrillo Fuentes. He sought not just a new face, but a new existence, one free from the crushing weight of his own legend. The man who had controlled the skies was ultimately trapped by his own mind, a prisoner in a gilded labyrinth of his own construction. The psychological portrait that emerges is not of a madman, but of a brilliant, tormented individual who sacrificed his entire self, his relationships, his peace of mind, and ultimately, his very identity on the altar of power. He is a tragic figure in the classical sense, a man whose greatest strengths, his intelligence and his ambition, were the very qualities that led him to a fate of isolation, fear, and a mysterious end that may have been, in its own way, a final, desperate search for a freedom that his billions could never purchase. The global impact of Amado Carrillo Fuentes' criminal enterprise extended far beyond the borderlands of Mexico and the United States, sending ripples through the international financial system, foreign relations, and the very strategies of law enforcement and intelligence agencies worldwide. His operation was not a regional problem. It was a globalized corporation dealing in a commodity with universal demand, and its effects were felt across continents. The most immediate and obvious impact was on the United States, where the flood of high-purity cocaine delivered by his network exacerbated a public health crisis, fueled street-level violence among distributors, and placed an immense burden on healthcare, law enforcement, and social services. The sheer volume he moved helped depress street prices, making the drug more accessible and addictive, and creating a new generation of users and dependents. But his influence stretched much further. The procurement of his fleet of aircraft involved a complex web of international shell companies, often registered in tax havens like Panama, the Cayman Islands, and the Bahamas, drawing the scrutiny of global financial watchdogs and highlighting the vulnerabilities of the international aviation registry system. His money laundering operations were a global endeavor, moving billions through banks in the United States, Mexico, Europe, and Asia, forcing financial institutions and regulators to develop more sophisticated anti-money laundering protocols, though they were often several steps behind his financial architects. The constant, high-level corruption he engineered within the Mexican government created a deep and lasting crisis of confidence in one of America's most important bilateral relationships. The pervasive suspicion that elements of the Mexican police, military, and political class were on his payroll poisoned cooperation between DEA agents and their Mexican counterparts, leading to mistrust, failed operations, and diplomatic friction at the highest levels. This erosion of institutional integrity had a corrosive effect on Mexican democracy itself, undermining the rule of law and convincing many citizens that the state was either incompetent or complicit. On a strategic level, Amado's success forced a fundamental reassessment within international law enforcement. His use of sophisticated technology, from commercial jets to encrypted communication, demonstrated that traditional interdiction methods were becoming obsolete. He was a non-state actor with the resources of a small nation, and combating him required a new, more integrated approach. This led to increased intelligence sharing between agencies like the DEA, CIA, and their European and South American counterparts, and a greater focus on following the money trail, using financial intelligence as a weapon to dismantle criminal networks. His model was so successful that it was eagerly adopted by other criminal organizations around the world, from the Italian mafia to Balkan trafficking groups, who saw the benefits of operating as a lean, logistics-focused business. The Lord of the Skies did not just traffic drugs, he trafficked an idea, a blueprint for 21st century transnational crime. Furthermore, his actions had a profound impact on the source countries in South America. By providing such an efficient and massive transportation service, he empowered the Colombian Cali cartel, enabling them to surpass the more violent Medellin cartel and dominate the global cocaine trade for a period. His operations also involved using airstrips and transit routes in other South and Central American nations, corrupting local officials and spreading the violence and instability associated with the drug trade. The aftermath of his disappearance also had global consequences. The violent war for control of his empire turned Ciudad Juárez into a global symbol of narco-violence, a cautionary tale that was reported on by international media and studied by security analysts worldwide. The power vacuum he left behind destabilized the entire hemisphere's criminal landscape, leading to shifting alliances and brutal conflicts that continue to this day. The story of Amado Carrillo Fuentes is, therefore, not a closed chapter in Mexican history. It is a foundational event in the history of globalization's dark side, a case study in how one man's logistical genius could reshape international crime, corrupt governments, challenge superpowers, and leave a legacy of violence and institutional decay that would be felt for generations, proving that in the modern, interconnected world, the actions of a single, determined criminal phantom in the deserts of Mexico could indeed cast a very long and dark shadow across the entire globe. The final, bewildering chapter in the life of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the botched plastic surgery and its immediate, chaotic aftermath, remains a tangled web of fact, speculation, and deliberate obfuscation, a crime scene where the evidence was systematically destroyed and the key witnesses were violently silenced. To piece together the events of early July 1997 is to navigate a narrative deliberately designed to be impenetrable. The official version, as steadfastly maintained by the Mexican Attorney General's office, is that Amado checked into the Santa Nica Hospital in Mexico City under the alias Antonio Flores Montes for a series of extensive procedures intended to alter his appearance so radically he would become a new man. The surgery, lasting between 6 and 8 hours, was a marathon of physical transformation, rhinoplasty, liposuction around the jaw and abdomen, and work on his eyes and cheekbones. The medical team was led by the prominent plastic surgeon, Dr. George Reyes Pez, with Dr. Carlos Colin S.U. Mano as the anesthesiologist. According to this official account, the crisis began when Amado suffered a catastrophic drop in blood pressure and went into cardiac arrest. The cause was attributed to a combination of factors: the immense physiological stress of the prolonged surgery, a possible overdose or adverse reaction to the powerful anesthetic doliprane, and the presence of cocaine in his system, which could have placed a fatal strain on his heart. Despite frantic resuscitation efforts, he was declared dead in the early morning hours of July 4th, 1997. It is what happened next that fuels the fires of conspiracy. Instead of sealing the room and calling the authorities for an official investigation and autopsy, his inner circle, led by his brother Vicente, went into immediate damage control. The body, the story goes, was swiftly removed from the hospital, transported to a private funeral home and subjected to an aggressive, rapid embalming process that involved draining the blood and injecting strong preservative chemicals. The body was then sealed inside a metal coffin before any independent law enforcement agency could properly examine it. When the coffin was finally opened days later for a visual identification by a judge, the corpse was described as being in a horrifying state. The face was grotesquely swollen and disfigured, the skin discolored to a greenish black. The features rendered unrecognizable by the combined effects of the failed surgery and the corrosive embalming fluids. The official identification was made by matching a fingerprint from the corpse to records held by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, a fact that many skeptics found ironic given their long-standing pursuit of him. This sequence of events, the hasty embalming, the sealed coffin, the unidentifiable body, is the cornerstone of the belief that his death was staged. Critics of the official story ask a simple, logical question: why the rush to destroy the evidence? If this was a genuine medical tragedy, why not allow a full and transparent autopsy to confirm the cause of death? The answer, according to the conspiracy, is that the body was not Amado's, but that of a look-alike, perhaps a low-level Sicario who was sacrificed and mutilated to serve as a convincing corpse. The rapid embalming was necessary to ensure the body was too decomposed for anyone to question the identification. The murders of the medical team weeks later only deepened the mystery. The bodies of Dr. Reyes Lopez and Dr. Colin Savmano, along with several nurses, were found stuffed into steel drums, showing clear signs of torture. Were they killed by the Carrillo Fuentes family as revenge for their failure? Or were they eliminated by Amado himself or his allies to ensure the secret of his survival died with them? The torture suggests the killers were seeking information, perhaps trying to confirm the details of what truly happened in that operating room, or punishing them for having that knowledge. Every piece of the official puzzle fits a little too neatly. Every action taken by his organization in the hours after his death seems perfectly calibrated to create maximum doubt and minimum verifiability. The man who had mastered the art of invisibility in life seemed to have engineered the perfect disappearance in death using the tools of his trade: corruption, intimidation, and ruthless efficiency to create a final, enduring enigma. The truth of what happened in the Santa Monica Hospital is known only to a handful of people, most of whom are now dead, leaving the world with two equally compelling possibilities: a shocking, almost absurd end for a criminal mastermind, or the most brilliant and final escape of the Lord of the Skies. The violent and rapid unraveling of the Juarez Cartel in the years immediately following Amado Carrillo Fuentes' disappearance, as testament to his empire, was a personal fiefdom, an intricate machine that only he knew how to operate at its peak efficiency. His death or vanishing act did not simply create a power vacuum. It removed the central processor from a vast and complex computer, causing the entire system to crash and fragment into warring, dysfunctional parts. The succession by his brothers Rodolfo and Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was a logical transition of power within the family-based structure. But it quickly proved to be a catastrophic failure of leadership. They inherited the throne, but they lacked Amado's unique amalgam of strategic vision, diplomatic cunning, and, most importantly, his seemingly unshakable grip on the levers of corruption at the very highest levels of the Mexican government. Without Amado's personal relationships and his unparalleled ability to distribute bribes with strategic precision, the cartel's protective shield began to corrode. The deep-seated corruption he had cultivated did not vanish overnight, but it became more transactional, less reliable, and more susceptible to being outbid by rivals or cracked by renewed law enforcement pressure. The first and most devastating challenge came from their former allies in the Sinaloa cartel, led by the relentlessly ambitious Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. El Chapo saw the transition as a moment of profound weakness, a golden opportunity to seize control of the lucrative Juarez Plaza, the crown jewel of smuggling routes into the United States. The tolls he had once paid to Amado were now a thing of the past. He was no longer willing to be a tenant in a kingdom he believed he could own. What followed was a war of unprecedented barbarism, a conflict that transformed Ciudad Juárez from a bustling border city into the epicenter of a humanitarian crisis, earning it the grim title of the most violent city in the world. The battle for the streets was fought with a new level of savagery, designed to terrorize the population and demoralize the enemy. Public massacres became commonplace, with gunmen storming birthday parties, rehab centers, and bars, mowing down dozens of people at a time in a brutal demonstration of power and disregard for human life. Bodies were hung from overpasses, decapitated heads were rolled onto dance floors, and narcomantas, message-laden banners, were displayed to taunt rivals and authorities. The cartels recruited younger, more addicted, and more ruthless sicarios, often from the city's impoverished youth, creating a generation of killers with little to lose. The violence was not confined to the combatants. It bled into every facet of society. Police chiefs were assassinated within hours of taking office. Journalists were murdered for their reporting, and ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted to sow terror. The city's homicide rate skyrocketed, with thousands of people killed each year, many of them victims of the brutal turf war. The Juarez Cartel, under Vicente's leadership, fought back with equal ferocity, but it was a defensive, reactive struggle. They were no longer the innovative, dominant force they had been under Amado. They were a wounded beast, fighting for its life against a pack of hungry predators. Beyond the Sinaloa threat, other factions sensed blood in the water. The Gulf Cartel and their notoriously brutal enforcement arm, the Zetas, many of whom were former Mexican Special Forces soldiers who had once been on Amado's payroll, saw an opportunity to expand their territory into the cartel's weakened domains. The Beltran Leyva organization, once aligned with Sinaloa, also entered the fray, forming and breaking alliances in a dizzying, deadly dance. The Mexican government's decision to launch a military offensive against the cartel's in 2006, under President Felipe Calderon, further destabilized the situation. While intended to restore order, the deployment of soldiers often had the effect of disrupting the existing, albeit violent, balance of power, removing capos and creating even more violent and chaotic succession struggles. The Juarez Cartel, which had once operated with the sleek efficiency of a multinational corporation under Amado's command, devolved into a fractured, blood-soaked shadow of its former self, its legacy not one of power and innovation, but of a devastating and protracted war that consumed the very city it was built upon, a grim and lasting monument to the fact that without its founding genius, the empire was doomed to a swift and brutal collapse. The figure of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, when placed on the global stage of 20th century crime, demands a comparison with his only true peer in terms of scale, wealth, and notoriety, Pablo Escobar, the flamboyant and terrifying king of the Medellin cartel. The juxtaposition of these two men, one Colombian and one Mexican, reveals two radically different philosophies of power, two contrasting blueprints for building a criminal empire, and ultimately, two very different legacies. Pablo Escobar was a force of nature, a populist demagogue who waged a literal war against the state. His power was built on a foundation of sheer terror, exemplified by bombings in public squares, the assassination of presidential candidates, and the infamous offer of plata o plomo, silver or lead. He cultivated a Robin Hood image, building neighborhoods and soccer fields for the poor of Medellin, while simultaneously ordering the murders of thousands, including judges, journalists, and police officers. He was a public figure, his face known to every Colombian, his name a daily headline. He reveled in his notoriety, even serving a brief term as a congressman, and his ambition was not just to be rich, but to be powerful in the legitimate political sphere. His was a strategy of overwhelming, audacious force, a direct challenge to the authority of the Colombian state, which he brought to its knees for nearly a decade. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, in stark contrast, was a phantom, a corporate strategist who operated from the shadows. His power was not built on a cult of personality, but on a cult of anonymity. Where Escobar sought the spotlight, Amado fled from it. His strategy was not to confront the state, but to subvert and co-opt it from within. He did not build housing for the poor. He built a parallel government by bribing generals, police commanders, and politicians. His violence, while equally brutal, was often more targeted and discreet, aimed at rivals and traitors rather than the general public. He was not a populist. He was a silent partner in the highest echelons of power. His innovation was logistical, not ideological. He saw himself not as a revolutionary, but as the CEO of the world's most efficient shipping company. This fundamental difference in approach dictated their respective downfalls. Escobar's very public war against the state, including the bombing of an airliner and the murder of a beloved presidential candidate, galvanized a national and international coalition against him, culminating in the formation of a special police unit, Los Peeps, and his eventual death on a Medellin rooftop in a hail of gunfire. His empire died with him because it was built around his larger-than-life persona. Amado's downfall, or alleged disappearance, was triggered by the quiet, relentless pressure of international law enforcement, particularly the DEA, and the fear of extradition to the United States. His empire did not die in a spectacular shootout. It fractured and crumbled in a bloody war of succession, because its success was dependent on his unique, behind-the-scenes management. Escobar's legacy is one of dramatic, cinematic violence and a nation traumatized by his war. Amado's legacy is more insidious, a blueprint for the modern, corporatized cartel that operates like a business and corrupts like a government. He demonstrated that in the late 20th century, the most effective criminal was not the loudest revolutionary, but the quietest bureaucrat of violence. Escobar was a spectacular firestorm that burned brightly and was extinguished. Amado was a slow, corrosive poison that seeped into the very foundations of the state, and whose toxic effects continue to be felt long after the source has vanished. One represented the explosive end of an era of flamboyant capos. The other represented the cold, efficient beginning of the new age of criminal enterprises that are harder to see, harder to fight, and in many ways far more dangerous to the long-term health of a nation. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey through the shadowed life of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, a journey that has traversed the dusty Sinaloan highlands, the clandestine runways of the desert, the gilded corridors of unimaginable wealth, and the sterile, fateful operating room in Mexico City. From his humble beginnings in a family steeped in the illicit traditions of the land, he rose through the ranks with a quiet, calculating patience that set him apart from his more flamboyant contemporaries. He witnessed the rise and fall of the Guadalajara cartel, learned from its mistakes, and when the moment of fracture arrived, he seized his destiny with the grip of a master strategist. His revolutionary vision was not to produce the product, but to master its journey, to become the indispensable gatekeeper between the coca fields of South America and the insatiable appetite of the United States. In doing so, he redefined the very architecture of international drug trafficking, corporatizing it, industrializing it, and elevating it to a level of sophistication that law enforcement agencies struggled to comprehend, let alone combat. He built an empire on two pillars: flawless logistics and systemic corruption. His fleet of Boeing 727s was more than just a bold smuggling tactic. It was a symbol of his audacious reach, a declaration that the sky itself was his domain. His corruption was not petty bribery, it was a strategic, deep-rooted infiltration of the Mexican state, a project to build a parallel government where his word was the ultimate law. He became a phantom emperor, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe, whose power was felt everywhere, but whose face was seen by almost no one. He accumulated a fortune so vast it became a physical force, a river of cash that reshaped economies and corrupted souls. Yet it could not buy him the peace of mind he so desperately craved, the paranoia that was his constant companion. The price of his throne ultimately drove him to his most desperate and defining act, The attempt to erase his own identity, to become a ghost and vanish from the world he had conquered. The result was the ultimate enigma, a death shrouded in such convenient mystery that it has fueled decades of speculation and legend. Whether he died on that operating table from a catastrophic medical error or successfully staged his own death to enjoy his billions in anonymous peace is a question that may never be conclusively answered, but his legacy is undeniable and starkly visible. The corporate model he pioneered for the Juarez Cartel became the template for every major criminal organization that followed. The systemic corruption he engineered left a lasting wound on the integrity of Mexican institutions. The violent war for his throne, a conflict that turned Ciudad Juarez into a slaughterhouse, is the direct and bloody consequence of his absence. He was a criminal visionary, a man of profound contradictions, a family man who presided over a slaughterhouse, a quiet introvert who commanded a global army, a logistical genius whose final plan ended in either tragic farce or perfect deception. His story is a chilling reminder of the corrosive power of unchecked ambition and the immense human cost of the drug trade, a saga that stretches from the remote villages of Sinaloa to the bustling streets of American cities, a trail of cocaine, cash, and corpses. The Lord of the Skies is gone, but the shadow of his wings still darkens the land.